I had always thought the only thing that burned in my life was the relentless sun on the cacao leaves, not the sudden inferno that now licked the trellis of my farm. The first crack of flame snapped against the wooden posts, a sound that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning. I ran to the edge of the field, lungs burning, my fingers white as the bark in the heat. The roar of the fire swelled, louder than the distant whisper of the river, and through the crackling smoke the CEO's voice floated, filtered through a tinny radio, thick with menace. "You'll do what we say, or you'll be gone." I could taste ash in my mouth, the metallic tang of burning leaves and burnt coffee beans, and feel the weight of his threat settle on my shoulders like a stone. The irony of it all was almost too clean. A man who had built a corporate empire on the backs of people now threatening to make me a pawn in a drug cartel, all while pretending to be a champion of sustainable agriculture. Yet there was a strange comfort in the certainty of his plan. If he wanted to destroy me, he would do it with fire and a promise of a new, twisted life. I stared at the smoke curling into the sky, and a quiet, dark humor flickered in my mind, as if the universe itself had decided to give me a cruel joke to play on me. The field smelled of burnt rubber, of charred trees, of the sweet, earthy scent of cacao that had always been my solace. My hands, rough from years of pruning, trembled as I reached for the phone that would be my lifeline. I had built my life in the shade of cacao trees, the scent of ripe pods, the quiet of early mornings, but now the air smelled of fear and the faint echo of a corporate promise. I thought of my wife, of the child still growing in her belly, of the little girl who would one day harvest the beans I had planted. If I let this blaze consume everything, those dreams would fade into ash. Every heartbeat I felt was a warning that the stakes were more than a plot of land. My license to farm had been a fragile thing, stamped after years of meeting health and environmental standards, a shield that could be taken away if I dipped a finger in a crime that had nothing to do with cocoa. The corporation had been a threat since I first signed the lease, a looming presence that whispered about strategic partnerships and market expansion while keeping a close eye on my yields. I had always believed my family's future rested on the beans that grew beneath the canopy, but the CEO's threat turned that future into a bargaining chip. I imagined the day my wife would ask if the money from the sale of the cocoa could buy her a new car, or if the insurance payout would cover the new machine that would take the place of my old, aching tractor. If I did not fight, the people I love would grow up in a world where the only thing they could trust was a corporate name stamped on a certificate. And yet here I stood, surrounded by smoke with a phone that still rang and a choice that could either keep the dream alive or turn it into a memory. I was 32, and I had a child in the womb, a second generation that would inherit not a farm, but the echo of a crisis that could have been avoided. I thought of the day I would hand over a jar of beans to my daughter, telling her the story of how the sun's heat turned into a blaze, and how I turned that blaze into a weapon. It was a cruel irony that the very thing that sustained me had become the instrument of my own destruction. But every story of revenge is written with the knowledge that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of an uprising. I had no time for hesitation. I had to act before they could extinguish the last ember of my hope. I remembered the morning before the fire, the way the sun caught the dew on the cocoa pods and turned them into tiny golden orbs. I was in the field, my hands moving with practiced rhythm, pruning the vines, checking for pests, the scent of fresh soil rising up from the earth. It was a ritual that steadied me, a moment of calm before the storm. The cocoa tree is a patient lover. It takes years to bear fruit, and I had been tending to it for over a decade, dreaming of a harvest that could feed my family and sell at a price that would keep my farm afloat. The dream was simple: sustainable agriculture, fair trade, a community that could thrive. But the dream was fragile, wrapped in paper and hope, and the corporation's shadow loomed like a storm cloud. I had never imagined that the very thing that gave my farm its soul would be used to burn it. As I counted the pods, I could not help but think of my daughter's first bite, the way she would taste the beans, and how the flavor of justice was about to be served in a different way. The morning light was gentle, the air cool, and yet the heat that would soon roar through the trees felt like a prelude to a darker symphony. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, not just for the land, but for the future that would depend on my decisions. The fire was not a random act of vandalism. It was a calculated move. I saw the men in black uniforms, the slow, deliberate placement of the incendiary devices along the trellis. They set the fire in a way that would smolder at first, then flare, a slow burn designed to give me the illusion that I was in control. As the flames licked the canopy, the cartel's offer came through the very same radio, a voice that sounded familiar yet sinister. "Ickle, we've got a job for you." Stay with us and you'll have a new income, a new purpose. Stay with us or you'll be gone. The words were a thin veil over the truth. They wanted me to become an accomplice, to use my expertise in cocoa to smuggle drugs under the guise of legitimate trade. They promised protection, money, and a place in their network. I felt the cold bite of betrayal wrap around my heart. I had worked hard to build a reputation, and now, it seemed, I was being offered a role in a crime that would ruin my name. The irony was painful. The same people who had threatened to take my farm were offering to keep me alive, but only if I betrayed the very thing that gave me meaning. I could hear the crack of the fire and the pulse of my own heart in the same rhythm. The offer was a trap, a bait, and I knew I had to play the game if I wanted to survive. I tried to follow the path they set, but the road was full of pitfalls. First, the insurance company, which had been on my side for years, pulled a hard stop. They denied my claim, citing unforeseen circumstances and natural disaster that didn't fit their policy. The denial felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that the corporate giant had not only put a fire in my fields, but also put a damper on my ability to rebuild. Then there was my cousin, who had always been my confidant, my partner in the early years when we split the land and the profits. He turned out to be a double agent, feeding the cartel with my plans and manipulating the sale. I felt like a puppet, my strings being tugged by hands I thought were my own. And then the false offer of a buyout came from a group that claimed to be interested in sustainable agriculture. They promised a fair price, a future partnership, but the terms were laced with clauses that would strip me of my rights. Each twist in the story was a layer of deceit, a deeper wound that made the stakes feel even higher. I realized that the corporation was not just a single antagonist. It was a network of individuals and institutions that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The more I dug, the more I saw the web that surrounded me, and the more I understood that the only way out was to expose the truth. One night, while the fire had long since turned to ash, I slipped into the office of the company's former accountant, a disgruntled man who had left after a dispute. He handed me a USB drive and said, "If you want to know the truth, look at this." Inside was an email audit log that recorded every message sent and received by the corporate CEO, the logistics manager, and the legal team. The log showed hidden threads, coded language, and most chilling orders for the shipment of narcotics disguised as cocoa. I could not believe what I was reading. The CEO had built a corporate empire on the backs of people, and the email log was a receipt of his crimes. The irony was that the very tool that could have burned me down was now a weapon in my hands. I took a photo of the first email, the one that said, "Transport the goods to the docks, no inspection," and I felt a surge of anger. I had a log that could bring the corporation down, a receipt that could expose them for what they were. My plan was forming in my mind, driven by the dark humor that the universe forced on me. I was standing at the edge of a kingdom built on lies, and I had the keys to its destruction. The next day, I met with the former accountant again, this time in a coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans. He was nervous, but he agreed to help me. He told me they had a plan: send the audit log to the media, release it to the public, and let the court take care of the rest. The clock was ticking because the corporation had already ordered a raid on my farm, claiming that I was a threat to public safety. I had to act fast. I drafted a letter to the local press, a short, clear manifesto that outlined the injustice, the fire, the cartel offer, and the evidence. I also sent copies to a few lawyers who specialized in corporate fraud. The plan was simple: expose the truth and let the law do its work. I felt a strange sense of empowerment as I typed the last line: "Let the smoke clear and the truth rise." The irony was that the very fire that had threatened to destroy me was now the catalyst for my revenge. I left the coffee shop with a bag full of evidence, my heart racing, and a sense that the universe was finally giving me the chance to turn the tables. On the morning of the raid, I set the trap. I left the audit log at the front desk of the corporate headquarters, disguised as a routine maintenance file. The security guard, oblivious, closed the door and carried the file to the CEO's office. Inside, the CEO, a man who had once bragged about his sustainable practices, stared at the screen with a look that turned from smug to terrified. The media, already waiting outside, saw the file on the CEO's desk, flipped open to the email with the code for drug shipment. The press conference erupted. The CEO's voice was shaky as he tried to deny, but the evidence was irrefutable, the audit log undeniable. The law took its course, and the corporation's board began to crumble. The raid on my farm was called off, and the cartel's offer fell apart. The fallout was immediate. The CEO was arrested, the board members were fired, and the corporation's stock plummeted. The media coverage was relentless, the public outraged, and the corporate giant that had once threatened me was now a cautionary tale. The irony was that the fire that had scarred my fields was now a symbol of the corporation's downfall. With the corporation's empire in ruins, I turned to the ash that had covered my fields. I knew that ash was rich in minerals, and I could use it to enrich the soil. I dug deep, mixed the ash with fresh compost, and planted a new row of cacao trees. The soil smelled like fresh earth and the faint scent of smoke, a reminder of the fire that had become a catalyst for renewal. My wife and I sat in the shade of the new saplings, watching the little seedlings grow. The child in my wife's belly could now dream of a future that was not tainted by corporate greed. I felt the weight lift off my shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose. The irony of it all was that the fire that had threatened to destroy me had also given me the chance to rebuild, to turn ash into fertile ground. The new farm would stand as a testament to resilience, a place where I could teach my daughter about the importance of honesty, hard work, and the power of a single act of truth. The corporate giant had built an empire on deception, on manipulating the law, on the lives of people like me. But with the audit log in the hands of the public, the empire crumbled like a house of cards. The CEO's arrest was the final blow, a public confession that I had delivered through a stolen email. The board members were charged, the shareholders lost their investment, and the company was forced to lay off thousands who had unknowingly been part of the chain. The poetic justice was sweet, darkly ironic. The very hands that had tried to smother my dream had instead set the fire that burned them down. The city's newspapers ran headlines that read, "From cocoa to crime, the fall of a corporate giant." It was a story that would be told for years, a cautionary tale that no one would forget. I stood in the middle of my field, the new saplings reaching for the sun, and I realized that justice had been served not by violence but by truth. I had set out to protect my family, to secure the future of my farm, and to expose a corporate monster. In doing so, I found that revenge is not a single act but a chain of choices that lead to change. The irony of using a fire to destroy a fire is something I will never forget. I should have been angry, but instead I felt a strange calm. I had turned a dark moment into an opportunity. The legal system, which had once seemed like a wall, became a bridge. I had used the very tools that the corporation employed against them. The darkest humor of it all was that the act of burning my farm had set the stage for the corporation's downfall. I felt a sense of gratitude for the universe's cruel joke, which had given me a chance to rewrite my story. As I watched my daughter's baby grow, I knew that the future would be brighter, that the soil would heal, and that my family would thrive. I had reclaimed my life, and in the process, I had turned the fire that threatened to consume me into a flame that lit a new path. I walk through my fields now, the new cacao saplings standing tall, their leaves whispering with the wind. I think of the CEO's final words, how they echo in the silence of the night, and I smile because I know that the world has changed. The fire that once burned my farm has become a memory and a lesson. The corporation's empire is no more, and in its place, a new, honest farm grows. I have turned a corporate crime into a story of resilience, and the dark irony of my revenge will live on in the beans that sweeten the world. The ashes have turned to soil, and the soil has turned to life. That is the poetic justice I wanted, and it is the only thing that remains. I keep walking through the rows of young cacao like a pilgrim on a pilgrimage, the saplings nodding as if they know the weight of what has passed. The soil is now a kind of alchemy, ash, compost, and the faint sweet tang of cocoa that never quite left the air. Every time I root a finger into the earth, I think of the CEO's last, trembling words, a laugh that turned to a sob. That laugh was the sound of someone who thought he could own a piece of the sky and still feel a chill when he saw the wind brush the leaves. I smile, but my smile is not a victory smile. It's a relief smile, the relief that the fire that once threatened to consume me has become a lesson written in scarred bark. One morning, a reporter from the local paper knocked on my door. She was a young woman with a notebook that smelled of coffee and ink, her eyes bright with the same hunger for a story that would sell. "Ickle, we need the full story. The city's people are thirsty for justice," she said, her voice a mix of curiosity and ambition. I could see the irony in her eyes, the same ambition that once drove the corporate giant, now urging me to expose the truth. We sat on the porch, the sun slanting through the canopy, and I told her everything: the fire, the cartel's offer, the email log. She listened, her pen scratching, her face a canvas that reflected the same dark humor that had got me through the night when I'd remembered the CEO's email. She left with a headline in mind: "From cocoa to crime, the man who turned fire into justice." I closed the door and felt the weight of the story settle on my shoulders like a second ember. The legal battles that followed were not the kind of battles that end with a courtroom verdict. They were long, drawn out, filled with the slow thud of paperwork and the rustle of briefcases. The corporation's lawyers, those same ones who had once written the letters of guarantee for my lease, now sat in suits that felt too tight. They tried to use the audit log as a smokescreen, arguing that it was incomplete, that it was a collection of strings of data, not a confession. The court, however, saw the pattern. A network of hidden shipments, a culture of deception, a corporate veil that hid a crime. While the lawsuits dragged on, the stock prices of the conglomerate plummeted like a house of cards in a storm. I watched from the sidelines, a spectator and a participant, as the very people who had tried to chain me to a cartel were now shackled by their own misdeeds. In the weeks that followed, the corporation's former employees began to whisper in the shadows of their old offices. The logistics manager who had once bragged about his efficient supply chain now found himself jobless, his resume a paper trail of bullet points that read like a confession. The accountant who had once kept the books in neat columns now received a letter of apology from a small NGO that had helped him start a new life in another town. The board members, those high-ranking men who had once met in boardrooms with polished leather chairs, were now being picked up by the police for questioning. The irony was not lost on me. The same hands that once tightened the iron grip on my life now found themselves held by the very forces that had tried to crush them. Yet the story did not end with the collapse of a corporate empire. The real victory came from the new challenges that sprouted in the wake of the ashes. I had to learn to trade cacao beans in a market that had been reshaped by the scandal. The price of fair trade cocoa had risen, and investors who had once thought the industry a safe bet now saw the potential for profit in sustainability. I was offered a partnership by a small cooperative that had been looking for a champion to lead them. The irony was sharp. A man who had once tried to destroy my farm was now interested in my knowledge, my experience, my ability to turn a field into a product that could change the world. I refused the partnership, saying that I wanted to keep my farm independent, that my soil was not for sale. The cooperative, disappointed, moved on, and I felt a strange relief that my farm was still mine, not a commodity. When my wife gave birth to our daughter, the world seemed to pause for a heartbeat. She was a bright little girl, her hair a dark cascade that mirrored the cocoa leaves. I named her Kiana after the ancient word for strength, because she represented the resilience that had carried me through the fire. I held her tiny hand and whispered the story of the fire to her, of how the smoke had turned into a lesson and how justice had been served not by violence but by truth. She slept in a crib that smelled of fresh earth and the faint scent of smoke, a reminder that even the darkest moments can birth something beautiful. The irony of it all, how a man who wanted to turn me into a pawn had instead given me a child who would grow up with a story of resilience, filled me with a quiet, almost reverent joy. The next season, I planted a new block of cacao trees, this time using seeds that had been saved from the old harvest. The seedlings grew quickly, their leaves a deep, hopeful green. I taught my daughter how to prune the vines, how to listen to the subtle changes in the soil, how to respect the delicate balance of nature. We sat together at dusk, the sun setting behind the trees, and I told her how the fire had taught us that nothing is lost forever. The soil had turned to ash, and the ash had turned back into life. The irony was that the corporation's downfall had given my farm a second chance, a chance to grow something that would nourish others without the taint of deceit. In the end, I realized that revenge had been a catalyst for change, not an end in itself. The fire that had once threatened to consume my life became the fuel that ignited a new beginning. The corporate giant had been exposed, its lawyers were out of work, its stock had fallen, and its executives were on the run. The city's newspapers ran headlines that read, "From cocoa to crime, the fall of a corporate giant." The city had seen the truth, and the story would be told for generations as a cautionary tale. I felt a sense of closure, a poetic justice that was not bitter but warm, like the scent of ripe cacao on a humid afternoon. Now, when I walk through my fields, I do so with a sense of purpose that is deeper than any revenge could have given me. I know that the fire that once threatened to consume me has become a legacy that will grow with my daughter, with the soil, with the trees. The irony of turning a blaze into a balm is something I will carry with me forever. It reminds me that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to turn ash into fertile ground, and that justice, when served with truth, burns brighter than any flame. The legal system had once seemed like a wall, but it became a bridge that carried me across the fire. The corporate empire was no more, and in its place, a new, honest farm grows. That is the poetic justice I wanted, and it is the only thing that remains. I sit on the porch railing now, watching the late afternoon light scatter through the leaves. My hands, still rough from the work, feel the same weight as they did when the fire first roared, but this time that weight is lighter, more like a promise than a threat. The night sky is a deep charcoal, and the stars appear as if they are watching over a new generation of cacao trees, each leaf a silent witness to the fire that once tried to destroy us and the truth that emerged from the ashes. The legal papers are closed, the court's final judgment signed, and the company's stock has been liquidated. The CEO's house sits empty now, a shell that once echoed with the sound of his voice. He has fled to a remote island, and his lawyers are still trying to find a way to repay the debt he owes the nation. In a strange way, I feel a pang of sympathy for the man who thought he could own the sky. He has been reduced to a man who can no longer claim ownership of anything but the memories he once held. The irony is a silent joke that hangs in the air, a reminder that no empire survives when it is built on false promises. I look back at the fields and see in the distance a small group of children running between the rows, their laughter echoing like a chorus of hope. One of them, Kiana, has grown taller, her hair now a dark braid that sways with each step. She has been taught to tend the vines, to understand the rhythm of the soil, and to recognize that every seed carries a story. I watch her prune the branches with a gentle hand, and I think of the fire that taught us that growth can come from destruction. She doesn't know the full story of the estate's past, but she knows the lesson, that every act of cruelty can be turned into a seed of resilience if we choose to nurture it. The community has rallied around us. There are farmers from neighboring plots who came to help clean up the ash, who brought charcoal for the soil, and who shared their own seeds to diversify our crops. We have started a small cooperative, not to profit from the scandal, but to share the knowledge that the fire taught us. We hold monthly gatherings where we discuss soil health, fair trade, and the importance of transparency. The same people who once whispered about the CEO's deals now sit around a table with us, listening to the story, and some even offer to invest in our new planting. It is a strange and comforting irony that the people who once feared us are now part of our new beginning. When I think of the legal process, I realize that it was never about revenge alone. It was about holding a corporation accountable, about making sure that the shadow of its greed would not loom over the next generation of farmers. The audit log did not just expose hidden shipments, it exposed a culture that had treated people like commodities. By sharing it with the press, I forced a reckoning that was inevitable. The public, outraged and curious, demanded answers. The court delivered them, and the company paid its price. The legal system, once a wall, became a bridge, and that is the true victory. Now, as the new cacao season begins, I feel a strange sense of anticipation. The first pods are already forming, their husks a deep, dark green. I know that the soil, rich with ash and compost, will nurture these pods better than any soil in the market. The price of our beans will be higher, not because of the scandal, but because of the story that accompanies them. Consumers will pay a premium for beans that carry the weight of justice and the promise of sustainability. In this way, the fire has not only cleared the way for a new farm, but has also paved a path for a more honest and fair market. There is still work to be done. The legal paperwork is finished, but the legacy of the corporation's actions will take years to fully heal. I will continue to monitor the market, to keep an eye on any remnants of the old company's influence. I will teach my daughter to ask questions, to never accept a story at face value, and to always look for the truth beneath the smoke. I will keep the archive of the audit log safe, a reminder that evidence can be a weapon when wielded with integrity. In the evenings, I sit with my wife under the canopy of cocoa trees, the air filled with the sweet scent of ripening pods. We talk about the future, about the children we will raise, about the land we will protect. We laugh at the absurdity of how a corporate giant's greed led to a fire that then sparked a legal battle and a new way of farming. The irony is not cruel anymore. It is a lesson, a story of how a single act of destruction can lead to a greater good if we choose the right path. When I finally close my eyes at night, I see the fire, the ash, the email log, and the faces of everyone who stood with me. I hear the CEO's last, trembling words echoing in the wind, a sob that turned to a laugh. I feel the weight of the past lift, replaced by a lighter, more hopeful burden. The fire that once threatened to consume me has become a legacy that will grow with my daughter, with the soil, with the trees. The irony of turning a blaze into a balm is something I will carry with me forever. It reminds me that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to turn ash into fertile ground, and that justice, when served with truth, burns brighter than any flame. The legal system had once seemed like a wall, but it became a bridge that carried me across the fire. The corporate empire was no more, and in its place, a new, honest farm grows. That is the poetic justice I wanted, and it is the only thing that remains.